Going to focus a lot of our time and energy on Senate Bill 2. We've had some questions in advance. Hopefully we'll answer those, but as we go along, if you've got questions, let us know. So let's get right at it. Where are we? Well, House and Senate have adjourned sine die. That means without assigning a day for further meetings. So they're done, unless the governor were to call them back for a special session, which he has indicated he is not going to do. What's the damage? 7,325 bills. That's about 1,000 more than last session. They passed 1,426 of them, almost a 20% passage rate, which is slightly higher than last session. And 200 more bills passed this session than last. The governor's already vetoed 6 bills. Last session he vetoed about 50, so we'll see. That date's still coming up on June the 16th. There were 105 joint resolutions. Those are the amendments to the Constitution. 8 of them passed. Slightly fewer number on both of those. There'll be a constitutional amendment election in November. Here's the full statistics by party. You can kind of take a look at that. The PowerPoint will be available for you to look at and peruse at your convenience if I move through any of the slides too quickly. Sunday, June 16th is the last day for the governor to sign or veto bills. That's the 20th day following final adjournment. Monday, August 26th is the 91st day following adjournment, where bills that don't have effective dates in them actually would become effective. So let's kind of run through and recap where we were with Safety's legislative agenda. Remember, our primary goal was to oppose any property tax reform proposals that restricted ESD's abilities to accomplish their mission, protecting Texans' lives and property. Well, Senate Bill 2 is the big bill that was coming through that impacted that topic. The Senate Bill 2 did pass. At the end, there was a conference committee. The members of the Senate and the House conferees worked out a negotiated resolution. Here's the outcome. The bottom line is that most of the ESDs in the state are going to be affected with a 3.5% voter approval tax rate. If you're a special taxing unit, some water districts aren't subject to that 3.5%. The 8% would apply to hospital districts, community colleges, and entities with tax rates of less than 2.5 cents. What does that mean? Well, if the effective rate as we used to know it is now the no new revenue tax rate. The rollback rate as we used to know it is now the voter approval tax rate. The semantics of that was basically to try and give people a better understanding of what was going on with these various tax rate calculations. The deadlines are generally the same, although the time schedule is compressed, particularly the appraisal deadlines. August 1st is the deadline for a certified appraisal roll. August 7th is the deadline for you to complete your tax rate calculations and get those posted on your website. Notice I said, and post those on your website. So websites have come about. Everybody's going to be expected to have them so you can notify the voters. There's a September 30th deadline still to adopt your tax rate at or below the voter approval tax rate. We'll talk about what happens if you go over. If you're going to go over your voter approval tax rate and potentially your de minimis rate, we'll talk about later, then you have to adopt your tax rate and call an election by mid-August. There's the acceleration in the timetable. The reason I say mid-August is that the law says that if you're going to go over your voter approval tax rate or your de minimis, then you have to call your election no later than the 71st day before the uniform election date in November. And for practical purposes, that's mid-August. So you don't have a lot of time to get that done if you're going to exceed that rate. There are some changes to the notice requirements that you need to be aware of. You don't have to publish the no new revenue rate or the voter approval rate like you used to have the counties or yourselves publish the effective rate or the rollback rate. There's one notice that's required for all meetings to adopt your tax rate. No matter what kind of jurisdiction you are, everybody's got to have a notice. There's only one hearing required instead of 2 now that can be held no earlier than 5 days after the notice if your tax is going to exceed your no new revenue rate. So this is equivalent to the 2 hearings you had to have if your tax was going to exceed the effective rate. Another change, the board can actually vote on your tax rate at that hearing so that everything could get done potentially in time for you to call that election in mid-August. That's why these time frames are a little bit compressed and why there's only one hearing. Excuse me. There's still a simplified notice requirement for units with a tax rate of less than 50 cents and less than 500,000 in revenue. So interestingly, that stayed in place. That just requires that you publish a notice of your meeting to adopt your tax rate, and you can move on down the road. You are required to post these notices on your website if you notify your residents or your taxpayers by publishing notice in the paper. You are not required to post on your website if you mail your notice to all of your taxpayers. So keep that in mind when you're going forward, choosing what your cost of publication is, your cost of your website compared to cost of mailing notices. Now, let's talk about a few other things in Senate Bill 2. There's an automatic election that's required for special taxing units or cities with more than 30,000 people if the tax rate is going to exceed the voter approval tax rate. So that's a mandatory election. At that calculation, that would be 8% for special taxing units and 3.5% for cities with more than 30,000 people. There is a petition election possible for some water districts, but everybody else gets an automatic election, as though it's a gift, an automatic election that's required if you're going to exceed the greater of your voter approval tax rate or the de minimis tax rate. We're going to talk about how those two things are calculated. First, let's talk about the de minimis tax rate. This was the compromise that came out of what last session was a $25 million exemption from the 3.5% rollback rate. The de minimis tax rate is the rate that gives you your no new revenue maintenance and operations tax, plus your debt service, plus $500,000 in additional revenue. So whatever that number calculates out to be, that's your de minimis tax rate. It is possible that that tax rate would be higher than your voter approval rate, but it's also possible that that tax rate would be lower than your voter approval rate. Now here's how the voter approval rate's calculated. Very much like the rollback rate with a couple of important differences. It's your operations and maintenance rate times that 1.035, that 3.5% increase, 8% for some of the special taxing units, plus your current debt rate, plus what's called the unused increment rate. Now, the unused increment rate that I'll define here in a minute doesn't apply to special taxing units. So they are set at 8% with no unused increment added on. So if your tax rate is that 2.5 cents or less, you don't follow through with the unused increment rate. Now there's a subtraction of what's called the sales tax revenue rate, but that doesn't apply to ESDs. I've had people asking questions about that. That relates to what's called an additional sales tax, which is a sales tax that is defined specifically to reduce property tax, and ESDs do not have access to that sales tax. All of these changes go into effect January 1, 2020. So as you go through your budget and tax rate cycle in 2019, you are operating under the current situation. You're operating under the current rules. But starting in 2020, you're going to have to take in these new calculations. So what's your O&M, your maintenance and operations rate? That's going to be that 1.035 times last year's maintenance and operations expenses divided by your current total value less new property value. This is exactly the same calculation as the way the effective rate was calculated, just with different percentage. Instead of 8% for rollback, it's 3.5%. What's the current debt rate mean? Remember, there was a House version of the bill as it was moving forward that said debt was only voter approved debt. That language did not make it into the bill. So debt still means the same thing it used to mean, but that is a bond or a warrant, some other evidence of indebtedness that's payable in one of three ways. That's payable solely from property taxes and installments over a period of more than a year. So ESDs, your revenue is property tax. If you've got a note that you're choosing to pay from your property tax revenue, you can treat it as debt. It cannot be budgeted for payment from your maintenance and operations funds. So you have to budget it for payment from your debt tax funds. And it's secured by a pledge of property taxes. So if you have debt that's secured by a pledge of property taxes, that can roll in to your debt calculation. And then finally, it's a payment made under a contract with somebody else to secure their indebtedness. Now what this means is that apart from any debt you have that's secured by a pledge of property taxes, you can choose whether or not to keep it as part of your O&M tax or whether to put it as part of your debt tax. So that's an election that's up. It's the same way that you've been able to make and set that debt tax rate for the last several years. Excuse me. So your current debt rate is the amount of money that's required for you to pay off your debt during the year, less excess collections, which means if you gained more debt tax revenue last year than you needed to pay your debt, then you get to that gets subtracted off what your current debt rate is. Let's talk about the unused increment rate, though, because that's a new one. The unused increment rate is the greater of zero, so you can never have a negative unused increment rate. But then you take the prior 3 years, the difference between the rate you adopted and the voter approval rate in a given year. So if you don't use all of your tax rate up to your voter approval rate, which is calculated every year, that increment you get to bank. And you get to bank that for the 3 prior years. Now, there's a provision in the law that says we are assuming that your unused increment rate for the 3 years prior to 2020 is 0. So whether you've been saving money under your prior rollback rate or not, it's 0. So that this banking only starts going forward and will become effective really to add on to your possible tax rate starting in 2021. The unused increment rate, as I said earlier, does not apply to those special taxing units, which would be ESDs with tax rates of less than 2.5 cents. The sales tax revenue rate, as I described, I left this slide in here. It's additional sales and use tax, doesn't apply to ESDs. So let's talk then. We can talk some more about SB2. We'll have questions, I'm sure, later, but I'm going to keep rolling through some of these other things. One of our other agendas was to make sure we didn't get impacted on sales tax. There really wasn't anything that was passed to limit our sales tax authority or to affect it. We did want to try and pass legislation to provide mobile integrated health care. Unfortunately, while that bill made it through the House with the help of Representative James White, it got stalled in the Senate by Senator Campbell, who was uncomfortable with expanding ESD services to that mobile integrated health care. We're going to need more work in the interim to develop a legislative package or piece for 2021. That's going to be an important focus over the next 2 years so that we can get that done. We also were going to propose and support legislation to clarify ESD's exclusive ability to designate service providers. That was found in House Bill 4350. Representative Dwayne Bohack really helped us with that. That bill is awaiting signature by the governor. Once again, he has until June the 16th. That bill clarifies that entities with jurisdiction to serve an area, which now includes ESDs, determine who is dispatched by emergency communication districts. Now, not all of the state is covered by emergency communication districts, but the vast majority of the state is. And so ESDs are now at the table in deciding who's going to be dispatched, particularly with respect to private service providers within their jurisdictions. So, we also had on our agenda that we would support efforts to simplify reporting requirements. There really wasn't anything passed to reduce the number of reports. There were a few things that were attempting to be passed to expand the number of reports. None of those really passed for us, but we'll keep an eye out. That's one of those things that might have had amendments as we were tacked on. And like I said, there's many, many bills that have been passed, and we're still working on reviewing that information. We also supported The TIFMAS increase in funding, unfortunately, through the budget, the TIFMAS funding remained the same. However, SFFMA and Representative Drew Springer were successful in getting another $23 million in unexpended fund balance allocated for those TIFMAS grants in under HB 2604. So look forward to having more money available in the grant program. Finally, we were going to monitor efforts to create or repurpose an agency to oversee statewide firefighting efforts. That really didn't occur, but the Division of Emergency Management was moved from the Department of Public Safety to the Texas A&M system. And that becomes effective once the governor signs. The governor has not signed that bill yet, but I'm anticipating that he will. So, lots of other bills. I'm not going to go into them in a lot of detail. You can find the language of the bills available online with some links that we talk about at the end. Or we can address these at later times, but it's just a lot of information. So Senate Bill 1083 by Senator Judith Zaffirini adds an adjustment to the account for sales tax revenue in compensation for ESDs when a city annexes an area. That bill passed both houses and is awaiting the governor's signature. There was a bill that continued annexation reform, essentially applying the House Bill 6 reforms from last session to all cities throughout the state. That's House Bill 347 by the representative out of Phil King out of Parker County. That bill has been signed by the governor, and now all cities are subject to those annexation requirements. There's also a bill that was passed awaiting signature by the governor that's a requirement for all the cities to keep maps of their current city limits in ETJ, and if they have a website, post that information on that website. That information has been difficult to come across over the past few years. Bills that impact employees or volunteers. There's a higher education fee waiver for disabled first responders that passed, waiting the governor's signature. There's a bill that passed to make sure that firefighter and EMS personnel, including volunteers, information is kept confidential so that the public can't get access to where those folks live or what their schedules are, those kind of things. That has passed but is awaiting the governor's signature. With respect to EMS, there was a number of bills, a couple in particular related to telemedicine that passed. HB 871 in particular allows trauma facilities to use telemedicine to get their designations. That was fairly significant, particularly for the rural areas. And then HB 1418 has been signed by the governor, which affects licensing and certification requirements for EMS personnel. And the driver responsibility program was repealed. That program had fees associated with it that went to trauma funding. It had an outstanding balance. That balance has been allocated out. That bill is passed, awaiting signature of the governor. Let's talk about some open government changes. Very few of you have used the emergency meeting notice, although it comes into play every once in a while. I think that occurred and needed to occur during Harvey. The posting time has been reduced from 2 hours to 1 hour. That bill is passed, awaiting the governor's signature. If you already have a website, you are required now to post your agendas and minutes on the internet. HB 305 is passed. It's awaiting signature of the governor. The cities, as I said, are required to post their ETJ and city limit boundaries on the internet. Any district with a population of more than 500 people is required to designate a place within the district for conducting all meetings. So, most of our ESDs are going to have more than 500 people. We're going to need to look at making sure you have designated your meeting place within the boundaries of the district. That has passed, and we're waiting for the governor's signature. Let's talk about a few miscellaneous bills. I've just thrown them in to this last category. There was a bill, HB 306, that's been signed by the governor. It's created an open burn pit registry program. There's also some employment protection for volunteer first responders that's passed, awaiting the governor's signature. Essentially protects those folks' job in the event that they are responding. There was also a bill that was passed that requires reciprocity between air ambulance providers. So as you're familiar, in the rural areas, air ambulance providers have membership programs. There is supposed to be now reciprocity and recognition of those membership programs between air ambulance providers. There was a motor fuels tax exemption for volunteer fire departments that was signed into law, and May 4th has been designated as Firefighters Day. All of those various bills passed. Let's talk about some of the future issues that I think we're going to need to be focused on as an association going forward. Senate Bill 29 failed to pass the House. This was the bill that was a big part of the governor's package to prohibit the use of public funds to advocate for or against legislation, frankly. The bill as it came out of onto the floor of the House was fairly watered down, but it failed to pass because the rural Republicans voted against it. And the reason they voted against it was because they argued that their folks who live in rural parts of the state need people to be able to come to Austin to advocate for them. It is such a big state, and they are little organizations that need help at the Capitol. That was the reason for their vote against Senate Bill 29. But that issue is going to come up again. Texas Public Policy Foundation has already put out material saying that was important for them. While it was a defeat, they're going to bring it forward in the next session. Second, there was an ESD bill that was going to assist the Harris County districts by allowing them to split into overlapping districts for services. In the course of working on that bill, we became aware that the governor was not happy with how the ESDs were functioning within the state. It was the first we'd heard of it. You might remember that 2 sessions ago, there was a lot of focus on special purpose districts, which resulted in a specific committee in the House and a lot of review of the various special districts. We didn't have much review under that, but I think that's coming in the next 2 years, and we're going to have to be paying attention to what the governor's policy folks are saying. The result of those things is that we need to focus on grassroots relationships with elected legislators. And what that means is we started with our legislative task force over the last year and a half, encouraging you to build those relationships with your members. And in the course of this session, it was very apparent which members were close to their ESDs and understood what their ESDs were facing. And they voted to support their ESDs when they had that close relationship. I think over the next interim cycle, everyone, all of our members need to make sure that you are building relationships with your legislators, with your House members, and with your senators, so that they understand what you're doing and we can prepare for the next session. You will have a final report on all the bills on the website, and you can check and review legislation and punch in the bill numbers from the presentation today. But there's a lot that happened. Obviously, out of 1,400 bills, I've covered maybe 20, and only a couple in some detail. So I'm happy to answer questions. I'm sure we have a few.
We will be getting, in addition to the last report or whatever, we'll have probably SB2, its actual text up on the website, and maybe we might be able to put together a one-pager or something about the highlights of it or something from your presentation, so everyone can have access to that, because that's where most of our questions are coming in on SB2. Real quickly, I want to throw in back how to get in touch with us. I'm trying to talk a little bit softer because I was told that my mic was not cooperating, so I'm going to try to watch my volume a little bit. But here's how you contact us. You can call 512-251-8101. Operators are standing by. Email us, saafed@texas.net. That's the regular safety email. Text me right here in the studio, as many of you have, to tell me about all sorts of different things. 512-567-0857. Normal text messaging rates may apply. And you can even fax your questions in. They actually go to an email address. There is no fax machine here in the studio. 512-251-8152. So we have a lot of questions. Many came in beforehand. So, and some of you I know had technical issues, maybe some lost audio during the SB2 discussion. So I'm going to go through all of these.
That sounds great. Let's do it.
I'm going to go through all of these. We're going to try to hit, it may be a review of everything. You may have already answered them, but I think it's so important and so confusing. You know, they really did a number on this one. So let's go. Where do we start? Oh, there's so many. Okay, unused increment rate. This was a big one on the unused increment rate. Is the tax rate calculated by subtracting the tax rate that was actually set from the voter approved rate over the previous 3 tax years? So can we just go back and
Sure.
and do the unused increment rate again? Just to, well, one question just came in here from what looks like to be West Texas, maybe El Paso. Is there a cap on the unused increment rate?
So here's the calculation of the unused increment rate. And as I said before, it is a sum of the difference between your actual tax rate and the voter approval tax rate in the prior 3 years. So there's not a cap necessarily on that rate. It is capped by what the maximum difference you might have. So I suppose for ESDs, the cap might be 30 cents. 3 years at 10 cents.
Right, but you
Max.
can't tax at 30 cents.
Right.
Right.
So then the calculation only is you only bank those increments going forward. So there is the unused increment rate for 2020 is 0. You get no credit for banking anything prior to 2020.
But in 2020, you can. So if you
In
set your
2020,
tax rate,
you will be able to, if you set below
September 30th, 2020, if you set below your
Voter
approval
approval.
rate, aka rollback rate, you would bank that increment.
you would bank that increment to the following year.
And then after, so does that evaporate after 3? Is that just for the first 3 years of this?
No, at 3 years, it's then a rolling 3-year bank.
Okay. Rolling 3-year bank.
So you would bank your difference in 2020, your difference in 2021, your difference in 2022. So in 2023, you could add all 3 of those together, but in 2024, the 2020 bank rolls off, but you add the 2023.
And from our calculations, about half of you were taxing under your rollback rate previously. Now, that was a higher
Correct.
rollback rate of 8%, but you were under it. You were actually under what would be the 3.5% rollback rate. Many of you
Correct.
were, so this may come in handy. There's not a cap on it, right?
Correct.
Like not a hard cap, at least. There's a practical cap in the 10
Correct.
cent. But okay, so
And let me just comment. I think the unused increment rate is going to be more significant for the higher revenue districts. Those districts that have significant amount of revenue. And the reason I say that is I'm going to roll back to the de minimis rate, because the de minimis rate is really going to make the impact of SB2 relatively small on our smaller districts, because the de minimis rate applies to a district with a tax rate of more than 2.5 cents. And what it says is you're entitled to add on to your no new revenue rate, right, your effective rate, $500,000 in additional revenue. And that extra $500,000, if you look at that number, that really means that very few ESDs are going to be subject to that 3.5 cents. In fact, maybe 3 ESDs are subject to 3.5%, but only 12 are being impacted by the reduction below 8% currently. Every other ESD in the state, a $500,000 increase in property tax revenue is more than an 8% increase in your revenue.
okay, so some of you out there have, getting $500,000 a year from your property tax by itself
Correct.
would be a huge year, almost unthinkable for some of you.
Right.
For many of you, so you can add $500,000 over what you got last year. Is that right?
Without having to call an election.
Right. No matter what that
Subject
rate is.
to our 10-cent cap.
Right.
So subject to our 10-cent constitutional cap, or if you have a lower tax rate that's been set through your historical stuff, like if you were an old RFPD at 3 cents, or you've somehow had your tax rate artificially set lower, subject to whatever your cap is, you could increase $500,000 without having an election.
Well, so what if that $500,000 number takes you over an 8%? What it would have been like if your voter approval rate had been 8%. Is an 8% increase over the no new tax rate, whatever they're calling the effective rate now.
Right.
So are you subject to a petition election then?
So the petition, I'm trying to find my page on this. Bear with me for a second. And I may not have the page that actually describes what you're talking about. So the automatic election is only is required if you exceed the greater of the voter approval tax rate or the de minimis rate.
Right.
The 8% only comes into play for the special taxing units, so the 2.5 cent districts, and the cities with more than 30,000 people.
Okay. So I'm an ESD. My voter approval rate of 3.5%, which I'm subject to, only would net out about $200,000 in new revenue for over last year. So I can go over that 3.5% up to a $500,000. But let's say at some point that crosses into like $500,000. I mean, for some of our folks out there, that's going to be more than double their tax rate.
Sure.
But so if they can go over 8%.
The de minimis is an exception to the election requirement.
Okay. Moving on, because we got a lot of these. How will the new tax laws and truth in taxation formula affect the debt? More specifically, if you can still use debt, the INS rate, to keep the lower rollback rate. So for those... yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, so the voter approval rate does include a component for debt service. And it's the same calculation that has been in place in prior years. So there's been no change in how debt service impacts your voter approval rate. It's just another one of the components. And debt service is, as we talked about, it's debt. And essentially, unless it's actually secured by a pledge of property taxes, although you could even take debt secured by a pledge of property taxes and plan to pay for it out of maintenance and operations funds. But it's really debt that you choose to have a debt tax rate placed on. Now, I always caution people,
don't do that,
against leveraging yourself with too much of that debt, because if that debt rolls off, then now you're really stuck, particularly under the law. If the de minimis isn't taking care of you, you're stuck at that 3.5% voter approval rate.
Right, which may be something y'all want to consider if you're one of those ESDs, and there's only not even a few of them that have like a 5-cent M&O rate, and you're using 5 cents towards your debt rate. That may be something, now that you're capped, I mean, that may be something to consider.
There's so many factors to consider, because the de minimis may impact that calculation as well.
Right.
It depends on how much revenue they have. I mean, ultimately, you really need to walk through these calculations with folks that can help you, look at the impact of the various exceptions and add-ons and all those kind of things. You don't want to inadvertently get stuck having to call an election to approve your taxes, because as we talked about and from a schedule standpoint, there's very little time between August 1st and mid-August to make a decision on a tax rate that's going to exceed your voter approval rate.
Right. How will the new rule specifically affect those districts already at 10 cents per 100 valuation? If you're already a 10-cent district,
if you're at 10 cents, then you're going to be impacted only to the extent that revenue growth causes your no new revenue rate to go down,
Right.
which it generally occurs in a good economy.
Right.
Value growth causes revenue, the no new revenue rate to come down,
Right.
which is then where if it goes down by more than 3.5%, you may be subject to some of these new requirements.
Right. So if you had a tax rate last year at 10 cents and you get told, well, to get that same amount of revenue, you're now at 9.3 cents,
Correct.
then you can only go up to 3.5% above that rate. Or if you're de minimis, the 500,000 takes care of you, which again,
Correct.
for most of y'all out there, based on what we know, you're going to fall in that de minimis. It's the larger revenue districts that are going to be.
And the 3.5% is 3.5% O&M plus your debt rate plus the unused increment rate.
Right.
So effectively, it shouldn't amount to 3.5%. It should be something higher, but somewhere in that ballpark.
Right. Okay, did the SB2 or HB2 provisions, SB2 provisions, 500,000 and the ability to carry over up to 3 years when tax increases don't exceed the 3.5% stay in the final version? Yes.
Yes.
So, yes, those are in the final version. Okay, let me go to some other questions. Let's see. Well, what is the status of the inspector bill filed by Springer? And apparently we were down for a second, but we're back. So
The inspector bill did not pass.
the inspector bill by Springer did not pass. So, okay, so that one didn't pass. Let's see. Where else are we? Please confirm the 3.5% provision of SB2 is effective with the fiscal year 2020 budget, correct?
The 3.5% becomes effective, the rules become effective January 1 of 2020. So I'm not going to assume, some people would call their fiscal year 2020 budget the one that starts October 1, 2019.
Okay.
So depending upon what your fiscal year is, the rules will apply for the adoption of your tax rate in 2020.
Right. Whatever tax rate you adopt after January 1st, 2020.
Correct.
Okay. So yeah. Let's see here. In regards to SB 1083, that's the annexation compensation requirement. When would it go into effect if signed, and if there's an annexation currently in process, would it fall under that act, that law?
I have not scrubbed the bill to look and see how it would impact an annexation currently in process. I believe the bill has a September 1 effective date, but I don't recall right offhand. The impact of the bill is very narrowly defined, and essentially it only provides additional compensation to an ESD if the proportion of sales tax that's being annexed from an area exceeds the proportion of property tax that's being annexed in an area. And so that could have an impact on you, but it's pretty narrowly designed for situations where there's large sales tax generators.
Okay. So how many past minutes agendas are needed to be posted on a district's website per HB 305?
I don't recall that detail right offhand.
Okay. Will SB2 impact faster growing ESDs rather than slower or built out ESDs?
It's going to impact all of them. Honestly, I don't know that it's necessarily going to target one over the other. There's a whole lot of SB2 that doesn't relate to the the tax rate process, that relates to appraisal reform. That may have the larger impact, at least on existing districts, because the property values of their existing properties are going to be subject to a different process and an appeal process for those homeowners.
Okay. Where in the law does it say you have to have a website?
Well, there are numerous references within Senate Bill 2 that require you to post something on a website. Now, it's not been tested, but the bill says post these things on a website. It doesn't say post them on a website if you have a website. There are, in fact, a few places in the bill where it does say that. And so consequently, I think if I was going to go into my statutory construction under the law, if the legislature had meant post it if you have a website, they would have said that. So now that being said, there's also nothing in the bill about penalties or provisions to fine you if you don't do it. There are some fairly significant consequences if you don't follow the process correctly. To have to go back to your no new revenue rate. So there's a good faith. If you tried in good faith to comply with the bill, then you can get the tax rate you wanted to adopt. But if you didn't, then you could be set at your no new revenue rate.
Okay. So in other words, and that question was from Annie out in Tyler in Smith County. And there were bills that said you had to create a website that didn't pass, right?
Correct.
I mean,
Correct.
Those didn't pass. So there's no bill out there that says your governmental entity has to have a website, right?
Correct.
But there are parts of SB2 that say, sort of imply that you should post on a website this information.
Right.
Okay. Does it matter where on your website you post it? Example, homepage or transparency page? Or?
Most of the website language says on your homepage, but some of it is not specific. So it just varies from provision to provision.
I know with regards to some of the SB 29 stuff, some of that snaked itself back in at the end, and I think we're going to have to look at some of that stuff for future.
So there was an interesting provision in another bill related to governmental entities that have contracts to provide consulting services to state agencies.
Right.
But that circumstance is relatively rare.
Right.
That a local government would provide consulting services to a state agency. But that language could be amended in the future to expand that. And it was, I think, put in the bill specifically as it relates to state agencies because that's what the caption of the bill was.
Right.
And it would have been a point of order to have tried to broaden that restriction.
So, and that was that Capriglione amendment
Correct.
that basically said if you have a contract, even if it's expired with the state agency, you have to do this stuff if you've ever hired a lobbyist.
Correct.
There was also something that I think Creighton got in one of his bills that said, but that applied only to counties, I think, or mostly to counties. But that was some more of that SB 29, no public funds to advocate for local taxpayers.
And like I said, I mean, the reason it didn't pass was because of the rural folks saying we need a voice in Austin.
Right.
We need to have people be able to go to Austin and talk to our legislators for us because we're so far away and we don't have the resources to do it ourselves.
There's two competing issues with the taxpayer, public local entities having lobbyists or doing legislative advocacy. And one is the instance where you have, like some of our ESDs, hire lobbyists themselves directly. Then there was another part of SB 29 that tried to attack the idea of joining an association like Safety or even TML or TAC or any association that has a lobbyist. And those to me are two competing sort of, and it'll be interesting to see how that, because there's a big difference between the city of Houston hiring a lobbyist for a whole bunch of money, which is one thing that they said they were trying to fix, and then this other issue of like ESDs just trying to get together and having somebody advocate for ESDs like you or TML doing that kind of thing. And that's what I think some of that bill is some of those rural, I mean, correct me if I'm wrong, but some of those rural folks said the only way our folks have any ability to stay in tune with what's going on in Austin, ability to advocate is through these associations because they can't hire these lobbyists.
Correct.
Right.
Correct.
Okay. Clarification from Paula. The effective date of SB2. If an ESD has an October to September fiscal year, Do SB2 rules apply to the tax rate that will be voted on in 2019 or
No.
2020? 2020. So it's if you're 2019 to 2020, that means you're passing that tax rate September 30th, right?
So important distinction, your fiscal year has nothing to do with your tax rate.
Right.
Right? Tax rates are set in September for the tax year that began January 1.
Right.
So your fiscal year is just funded by your tax revenue stream, but those two are not technically tied together. So your tax rate that you set in 2019 is not subject to the SB2 reform.
If you set the tax rate that you set in 2020
Is subject to,
which I guess theoretically you could do it whenever, but not until the tax rolls get certified, and you have to have a hearing. And
correct, and you can't do it till your tax rolls are certified,
Right.
and those will not be certified until
late
the end of July.
2020. September 2020 is really what we're talking about here.
Correct.
August to September, whenever you have that public hearing and set that tax rate and adopt your budget, that's when you.
Correct.
Right. Let's see. Give us an example of an ESD with $1 million budget and $500,000 in debt. I mean, okay, so $1 million budget, $500,000 in debt. I guess we'd have to know what your effective rate and.
There is no way to do that calculation on the fly.
Yeah, I mean,
I'm not sure. I mean,
but it's still highly unlikely that they're going to have an M&O rate that could possibly net them $500,000 more. If their budgets, let's change this little hypo around to be, let's just say it was $1 million in revenue last year,
okay.
at whatever they were taxing. To get an extra $500,000 in M&O revenue, that's going to be very difficult, right? Like you would have to basically have a 50% increase in your tax rate almost.
It depends. I don't know.
Based on how
I
their
don't know
values,
what their
right.
property
Okay.
values are. I don't know what their
But it
debt
seems,
payments are. Yeah.
It seems very unlikely. I can't say for sure, but if you got $1 million in tax revenue, and you're taxing it 10 cents or 9 point whatever cents, it's going to be very hard for you to cross that $500,000
I would think
threshold. It's going to be very difficult, right? How the debt rate figures into it,
I mean, the calculations are so complicated and so specific. I really hesitate to say anything about how it would impact a particular situation.
right, and with that $500,000 in debt, I mean, it depends on whether you're devoting an INS rate, right, to that $500,000 to service that, which many ESDs don't do because of the issues with the cap, right? Okay, did I say all that right? Am I somewhat right about that? Say yes.
Sure.
Okay. Okay, these are from some more questions I've been handed. Is definition of new property value the same as the old definition for value of taxable new improvements?
Yes.
Okay, so that's just what they're calling that.
They just called it the no new revenue rate instead of the effective rate. Calculation is the same.
What was the final definition of debt? We've kind of gone over that. It's
Correct.
basically the same, right?
Same.
What are dates when sections take effect of SB2? We've been hopefully January 1st, 2020, and for whatever
Yes.
you do after January 1st, 2020. Do you know if Truth in Taxation class will be held to help with training? I'm going to riff here. Yes, I mean we're going to have. Now that we know what passed, which we didn't know. I mean, there was still a chance that this whole thing could have fallen apart on Memorial Day weekend. It didn't, but. Now that we know it's passed, and now that our esteemed Legislative Counsel has had a chance to look at it and read it, and at least a first blush of what's going on, we're going to set up trainings on a lot of this stuff coming forward. Be watching your safety, your inbox, and the safety newsletters for this, because we want people to know what's going on, but we're still learning it in real time right now.
But I would also encourage, it's still early. You do not need to do this in 2019. You do not need to think that you have to do this in 2019, right? So that training would need to occur for the 2020 calendar year.
Okay. I've been told I'm being too, what's the word? too downtrodden about the whole thing. It's not the end of the world. Everybody's going to be fine. There's no reason for huge alarm or concern. There really isn't. I mean, like I said, SB2, most of you will not be affected by at least the tax rate increment, the tax rate stuff. There's a lot of stuff in there about notice and transparency that could be good and you do need to keep up with, but we'll be out there communicating that to you guys. The tax rate stuff, the larger revenue districts are going to be the primary ones that we're going to see affected. And, we always make the case that, if it doesn't matter, if you're a $10 million ad valorem revenue ESD, it's not right to call you a rich ESD, because if you have $9,999,000 in expenses or more, then you can be a $10 million property tax ESD and still be on a shoestring budget, because that's the responsibility of providing your citizens good service. So we never say rich or poor ESDs, we just say high revenue ESDs. And we made that case that the high revenue ESDs aren't necessarily just floating in money, and that fell on deaf ears. But it's okay, because it's gonna be fine, right, John?
Well, so I mean, essentially, and this is the way I actually testified on the bills. The appraisal process reform, the transparency stuff, that's all good, because the taxpayers need to understand why they're getting taxed at the rate they're getting taxed. They need to understand why their values are changing, and that reform was good. The bottom line is that we essentially have a dozen ESDs who are going to be subject to a calculated rollback that is less than 8%.
Right.
Now, everybody would have to go to an election if you exceed whatever that de minimis or voter approval rate is. And that presents some complications and some challenges. But the protections that are in with respect to the de minimis rate and the unused increment rate mitigate some of that pain. And I think those were actually put in to address many of the issues that we raised with members. We worked very diligently to present a reasoned approach, and while we didn't get everything we asked for, on the whole, we came out better than many others.
Yeah.
I'll point to the provision that says that if you're a municipality with more than 30,000 people, you don't get to take advantage of the de minimis rate. You're you're stuck having to have an election. If you go over 3.5%, you don't get some of those things. So, on the whole course, property tax reform was going to occur.
Right.
We knew that last session.
Right.
There were a lot of entities that fought tooth and nail against it, but it was going to occur. So, the bill has good things. It has some challenges in it. There's some things that I wish wouldn't have been in it, but that's legislation. So,
one last question. No posting changes to small taxing units?
So small taxing units, which are, I'm going to go to my slide where I talked about that. If you have less than a 50-cent tax rate, which is all ESDs, and less than $500,000 in revenue, you can use a simplified notice, which is that one notice. The notice is going to look different now, but you can use that simplified notice in lieu of the more complicated notices. Now, you still are subject to the automatic election provisions if you exceed the voter approval rate, whatever that may be, or the de minimis rate. So understand that while your notice may have changed, you still have access to that simplified notice. There's not as big of a benefit because it's just one notice now anyway. Mm-hmm. It's just one notice for one meeting.
Right.
So,
the obvious question that I just thought about is tax cap raises. If somebody's at 3 cents and they raise their tax cap to 6 cents or 10 cents.
If you have an election to increase your tax cap and that election is successful, and the following tax process, you want to go up to that tax cap, you are subject to the mandatory election provisions if you exceed the voter approval rate. So you're looking at 2 elections to rapidly increase your tax rate up to whatever your new cap is.
Right. But the de minimis still applies, right?
Correct.
Okay.
Which frankly, for a lot of our districts that are at 3 cents, they got less than $500,000 in revenue.
Right.
So they can double their revenue without having to have that mandatory election.
Correct. Which I think will again take care of a lot of folks, but it does get you at the margin.
It's important. I mean, you just really need to look at it to be able to plan going forward.
Okay. Well, we're almost out of time. I'm sorry, I didn't mean to be discouraging about anything. I actually think we had a pretty good session, ESDs did overall. The Emergency Communications District, jurisdictional exclusivity, as I call it, being able to designate your service provider, I think that's going to be a great law. All this is contingent on the governor, of course, but the annexation bill, the sales tax being part of the SB 1083, sales tax finally being part of the annexation compensation. Right. It's an either or kind of thing, right? But I think there was some good, and we didn't have any sort of attacks on our sales tax authority. I think SB 2 could have been a lot worse. So, and the no taxpayer, we don't have to figure out how to create a PAC to fund whatever, we don't have to worry about that for at least a couple of years. So,
no, we need to be worrying about it.
Okay, well, but I mean, it doesn't actually take effect.
Correct.
But yes, I want to end. Before we get to the thing, Paula wanted to make a statement that we need to do a strategy to develop grassroots relationships with legislators that do not have ESDs within their representation jurisdictions. I completely agree. There are a lot of ESDs out there, or a lot of legislators out there in West Texas, some in North Texas, that don't have ESDs. It'd be good to educate those folks because some of them really don't even know what an ESD is. I think it's good, like John said, grassroots relationships with your elected people, at least start with y'all's folks, and get involved. I want to give a shout out to Gail Fuller. I don't know if she's watching, but that HB 2446, that was something that she was really active in. Harris County ESD 7, the firefighter public information exemption. That's a good bill. I think we were in favor of it. You testified, and yes. But that was an ESD commissioner, sort of taking that ball. So we've got to wrap up now. But Jan 1, 2021 is too late to start contacts with your legislators. That's what I've learned from this legislative session. The calls when they're on the floor are great, and you guys did a great job when we were trying to get that amendment to exclude ESDs from SB 2. You guys were amazing. A lot of legislators said they got calls about ESDs from their ESD commissioners in their district. That was fantastic, but we've got to start even earlier than that. We've got to start really early during campaign season. I'm not saying you got to donate money or anything, but that's when they'll appear at public events and you can talk to them and say, here's what an ESD does. We're in your district. Just want to let you know. I'm not saying take a political position or anything. I'm just saying it could be good to get to know your legislator and develop that grassroots relationship. So that's my little soapbox. Anything else, John, before we give them credit and let them get out of here?
No, let's give them credit. Let them get out of here.